Mississippi, and the entire Gulf Coast. And that's just in North Louisiana, that there was a whole bunch of black Indians. And that passage is found in the primitive black nations of America. And prior to Hernando de Soto coming to Louisiana to colonize the Gulf Coast, he had arrived in Florida, off the coast of Florida, and automatically started warring with the Florida Indians, who was giving them hell the whole time. And De Soto had described the Florida Indians that he was at war with as being very large black Indians in an aspect different from those from the interior of North America because of the climate that they lived in. Because of the humid sun that they lived in, their complexion was very dark skinned and they had woolly hair. And that passage is found in the history of Hernando de Soto by Bernard Shipp, Louisiana and southern Mississippi, where all the black Indians who were in large numbers in southern Louisiana and Mississippi, they were captured into slavery, forced into assimilation in the colonies, and ended up having their identity reclassified and changed.
About the American Aborigines. There were tribes that were already here. And unfortunately, most people still believe that all blacks came from the ships from Africa. So let's talk about some of those statistics. According to PBS.org, only 12.5 million Africans were kidnapped from Africa, but only 10.7 million actually survived. And of that 10.7 million, 388,000 came to North America. And the rest were distributed to South America and the Caribbean. But the first people that were here were the American Aborigines. According to Indigenous and Americans.com, the American Aborigines owned 1 million square miles worth of land in the Louisiana Territory, southeastern region of Florida, and the colony of California. In many areas of America, black nations existed way before Christopher Columbus even arrived. Those lands were rightfully the American Aborigines before they were stolen and given to the white settlers. The American Aborigines that were stripped from their land were dumped in Oklahoma. And one of the most historic and sad tragedies was called the Trail of Tears. 40 to 90 Indians were placed there. The point is that the American Aborigines were here and they were here first.
The misidentification of black people in America as African American. I'd like to start the discussion off by making a statement that most of the black people in America are not directly descended from the black people in Africa, at least not via the transatlantic slave trade or the triangular trade. The black community in America have definitely been there for thousands of years prior to any European expansion into the New World, which brings us to our first question. How did we get here? And that's a very simple question to answer. The same way people got in Africa, Australia, Asia, and Europe. The same way the trees, the plants, and the animals got here. The Creator put us here.
Black people that are here in the United States now are not African. African American is what the white man has pinned on them to try to keep hiding their true identity.
Or is it ISIS? Or is it ISIL? Or is it IS? I mean, right? Let's just change the name as much as possible to throw you all off so you really don't know what's going on. Let's keep switching the identity to hide the people. Why don't we just keep renaming you? Are you Negro? Oh, no, you're not Negro. No, you're colored. No, you're not colored. You're African American. And this is what they name you. The slavers name you this. Because I know a white guy who grew up in South Africa. And he now lives in America. He is an African American, and more African American than most.
A lot of blacks don't know that they are Indians. And
why don't they know?
Well, they've been told that they're African American and that they came from Africa, but that they're really been here in the United States as Indians.
Absolutely.
And they're really just been given false information from the historical point of view.
Hello, I'm William Attlee and this is a news brief with truth. See the men on the screen. They are the ancestors of the African American, but there is a problem. Their true identity. Thomas McNeely has the story.
Well, William, the African American community is deeply divided due to the tagline, African Americans ain't Africans, which can be found in numerous places on the web. Now, it should be obvious as to why it's causing a commotion, but if it escapes you, let me explain. The current American education states African Americans were brought to America as slaves from Africa, which is simply not true. They are American indigenous, not descendants of Africans. As they say, the truth is stranger than fiction. Although this fact isn't spoken of openly, it's not a secret. However, with programming such as Roots, 12 Years a Slave, The African American Story, and the Book of Negroes, is it any wonder why so many African Americans are confused? We won't address all the misleading DNA tests being provided to connect African Americans to Africa. So, the argument is, do they continue identifying as African Americans, which is a fake identity for them, or embrace being identified as Indigenous Americans?
Are there any consequences of choosing one identity over the other?
William, that's a good question. According to African Americans Ain't Africans Facebook forum, identifying as African American is to quietly relinquish ancestral connections to America, connections that go back hundreds of thousands of years. A curious story, but one appropriate for February, which is Black History Month in the United States.
What a conundrum. A story worth keeping an eye on for further developments. Thank you, Thomas. The drawing used in this presentation is from the 16th century book America, being the latest and most accurate description of the New World by John Ogilvy and Arnoldus Montanus. As you may have guessed, the men in the drawing are American. I'm William Attlee, and this has been a news brief with truth.
Did you know the first Bible printed in America was actually in a Native American language?
John Eliot is one of the best-known Christian missionaries of early American history. A gifted translator and linguist, Cambridge-educated, he quickly began learning the dialect of the Algonquian language to speak to the tribes that inhabited New England. He printed his Algonquian translation of the New Testament in 1661, the first Bible printed in America. 2 years later, in 1663, Eliot's complete Bible of the Old and New Testaments in Algonquian were published. English and European language Bibles weren't printed in America until a century later. John Eliot's Bible not only brought the New Testament to the Algonquian people, it also documented and created a written language, one which did not exist before the Eliot Indian Bible was published.
Engage with the Bible in the stories of this book of books.
Brought to you by Museum of the Bible.
Inside Washington's Museum of the Bible, a single volume that is like no other. The so-called Slave Bible, remarkable not for what's in it, but for what's not.
So about 90% of the Old Testament's been removed and about 50% of the New Testament's been removed. To put it another way, a normal King James Version has 1,189 chapters in it. The Slave Bible has only 232.
Missing are chapters and verses that might have encouraged uprisings. Book of Exodus, redacted. No story of Moses demanding Pharaoh, "Let my people go." Gone is Galatians, and the verse, "There is neither bond nor free, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus." And no Jeremiah, "Woe unto him that useth his neighbor's service without wages."
What they've left in are verses such as Ephesians 6:5, which is the famous verse, "Slaves, be obedient to your master."
Looking at this Bible, it's hard to tell that anything's been taken out of it.
That's correct. I mean, it looks like a normal book. For many enslaved Africans, this would have been the first time they were exposed to the Bible.
A Bible selectively edited to instill obedience, using religion to underpin the horror of slavery. When people encounter this exhibit, what lasting impression do you want them to leave with?
But we want to pass the message on that may this never happen again. The Bible itself is a whole book. It's not one that you get to carve up and use this piece or that piece.
The Slave Bible designed to repress rebellion, but it didn't work. Enslaved people in the Caribbean constantly fought against slavery until emancipation.
I think it's very relevant to understand our history, not just American history, but our African American history, our roots and how we got to this point.
A dark chapter in the history of the good book. Jeff Bennett, NBC News, Washington.
This 1872 print by Currier and Ives shows the first 7 black Americans elected to the U.S. Congress. Significantly, all 7 were Republicans. On the left side of the picture is Hiram Rhodes Revels from Mississippi. An ordained minister, he served as a missionary and pastor, recruited 3 black regiments, and was a chaplain during the Civil War. Revels became America's first black U.S. senator. Next is Benjamin Turner of Alabama. Turner was a slave during the Civil War, but within 5 years after the war, he had become a wealthy and prosperous businessman. Next is Robert DeLarge of South Carolina. Born as a slave, within 3 years of the end of the war, he was serving in the State House. He also chaired the Republican Party's platform committee and became a statewide elected official. Next is Josiah Walls of Florida. Walls was a slave during the Civil War and was forced to fight for the Confederate Army. After he was captured by Union troops, however, he promptly enlisted as a Union soldier and even became an officer. After his election to Congress, his credentials were challenged by Democrats and he was twice sent home. He was re-elected after the first challenge, but during the second challenge, Democrats regained control of Florida and he was prevented from returning. Next is Jefferson Long of Georgia. Born as a slave, he was self-educated and built a thriving business. However, when elected to Congress as a Republican, Democrats boycotted his business, causing him great financial losses. Long was the first black American to deliver a congressional speech in the U.S. House. Next is Joseph Hayne Rainey of South Carolina. Born a slave, he actually served briefly as Speaker of the U.S. House and was in Congress longer than any other black American from that era. The seventh is Robert Brown Elliott, also of South Carolina. He was well educated, reading in Spanish, French, and Latin. In Congress, he led in the passage of civil rights bills over the strident opposition of congressional Democrats, and he later became Speaker of the House in the state legislature.
Colfax, Louisiana, the parish seat of Grant Parish, forms a predominantly African-American part of the Alexandria, Louisiana metropolitan area, with a population of less than 2,000. Estimated 2016 median household income in Colfax reached $26,000 compared to $45,000 for the entire state of Louisiana. Could events in this community back in 1872 still affect life there almost a century and a half later? Does history have that much power over the lives of people not even born a century later? Hi, I'm Tom Army, and welcome to another edition of United States History Online. In the years following the Civil War, the Grant administration sincerely attempted to make our nation whole and homogeneous. They implemented the Congressional Plan for the Reconstruction of the South with some apparent early successes. Congress required former Confederate states to draft new state constitutions and promised to uphold the U.S. Constitution, especially accepting the newly ratified 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The Republicans made it their goal to rebuild the Southern economy in the image of Northern manufacturing and commerce. Now, during the election of 1872, Southern Republicans and moderate Democrats spoke of their hopes for the restoration of prosperity. Historian Richard White wrote, they, the reconstructed Southern states, had accepted government intervention in the economy, aid to corporations, and the reality of black suffrage. The Panic of 1873, however, dashed those hopes. The disruption of credit made farm prices fall and unemployment soar. White supremacists linked their economic frustrations to their loathing of the new black voting rights and black involvement in local government. These whites wanted an opportunity to take back total control they had lost as the country focused on economic recovery for everyone. The mechanism they used to accomplish their objectives included obscene cruelty and violence, and it's difficult for us to fathom that today. Colfax, Louisiana, sits on the Red River, 220 miles northwest of New Orleans. Founded in 1869, its settlers named this community after Schuyler C. Colfax, the current Vice President of the United States under President Grant. Colfax was the seat of government in Grant Parish. Counties in Louisiana were called parishes. In the weeks after the 1872 local election in Colfax, both Republican freedmen and white Democrats claimed to have won offices in the local government. A federal judge ruled that the Republicans be seated. On Easter Sunday, 1873, black freedmen holding offices in Colfax, hearing threats of an assault, rightly assumed physical control of the courthouse. The assault did occur. 140 whites attacked, heavily armed with rifles, ammunition, and one cannon. The Knights of the White Camellia and the Ku Klux Klan apparently organized the assault. After an exchange of fire, the freedmen ran out of ammunition and surrendered. The attackers lined up those who surrendered outside the courthouse and then called each freedman out of line by name. As they came forward, they were shot. Some had their throats slit. The remainder were hanged. 165 freedmen were either killed in the fight or executed. 3 white men were killed in the attack. When news of the massacre reached Washington, President Grant declared martial law in Colfax. Federal soldiers eventually captured 9 of the men responsible for the slaughter. Only 3 were convicted. The following year, white supremacists organized 8,000 men to march on New Orleans and overthrow the Republican government headed by Governor William Pitt Kellogg. Grant then sent 6 regiments of federal troops under the command of General Philip Sheridan to New Orleans to restore order. General Sheridan wanted to suspend habeas corpus. Grant said no. Grant told the leaders of the Republican Party that this nursing of monstrosities in Louisiana has nearly exhausted the life of the party. By 1875, Southern Republicans controlled only the state governments in Mississippi and South Carolina. Democrats in the other former Confederate states had regained control of state and local government. Also, the U.S. Supreme Court was about to strike a final blow to the Republican efforts to maintain black political activity and suffrage in the South. After the Colfax massacre of 165 freemen, as I mentioned before, only 3 men were charged and convicted of violating the Enforcement Act of 1870. The act was originally aimed at curbing Ku Klux Klan violence, and it forbade conspiracies to deny constitutional rights to any citizen. The defendants appealed their convictions on the grounds that there was not sufficient evidence to convict them. The Supreme Court agreed to hear their appeal. In the case of United States versus Cruikshank, 1875, the Supreme Court sided with the defendants, saying that the rights they were alleged to have violated were not enforceable in this case. The justices argued that the First Amendment, the right to assemble, the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, were intended only to restrict the actions of the federal government and did not apply to the states or private citizens. In addition, the due process and equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment only applied to state action and not the action of individuals. Therefore, freedmen would have to turn to the state for protection and not the federal government. For the next 90 years, no protection ever came. The events on Easter Sunday, 1873, in Colfax, Louisiana, effectively ended Southern Reconstruction. If you travel to Colfax, Louisiana someday, look for the historical marker placed there in 1950. It reads, Colfax Riot. On this site occurred the Colfax Riot, in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. This event on April 13, 1873, marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South. In addition to that marker, go into the town cemetery and find a 12-foot high obelisk. On the stone, you can also read, "In loving remembrance, erected to the memory of the heroes, Stephen Decatur Parrish, James West Hadnot, Sidney Harris, who fell in the Colfax Riot, fighting for white supremacy. April 13th, 1873.
You're going to have to ask yourself a couple of questions by the end of the program. Why would our schools leave all of this history out? I mean, this is some of the greatest American story that you've ever heard. Why would they do that? And it's everywhere. You just don't know where to look. If you take a look at the revolutionary paintings of revolutionary times, here it is. This is the Boston Tea Party. Bunch of white guys, and then these people strangely looking like Indians, and they're not. But that's it, not a lot of racial diversity. If you watch movies, one great movie, this is John Adams. You watch John Adams and you don't see a lot of racial diversity. I'm currently watching Johnny Tremaine. This is... I love this movie. I remember this growing up. I was watching it with my kids just last night, and I noticed there are a couple of American Indians, but you don't see any African Americans unless they're slaves. They will show people as slaves, but that's it. Now, I want to show you a painting of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Here's the Battle of Bunker Hill. Bunch of white guys, right? Unless you know where to look. Right here. That's Peter Salem.
He was actually the hero of the battle. It doesn't look like he's a hero there. He looks like he's cowering behind the white guy with a sword. He was the hero of the battle. And he saved scores of American lives that day. Why don't we know this? Look here. African American, helping row the boat across. You know what his name was? Prince Whipple. He fought alongside Washington during the Revolution. Take a look at this one, this painting of, this is the Marquis de Lafayette. If you look at this, you just think, oh yeah, and then he made his slave dress up like I don't know what. But that's what you would think, right? This guy is incredibly important. This guy may have won the Revolutionary War. James Armistead was his name. How did he win the Revolutionary War? Double spy. I'm going to let David tell the story here in a minute, but basically the Brits thought that he was spying for them, but he was spying for General Washington. He'd give the Brits bad intel and reveal the good critical information to General Washington. Did you know this story? Why? I'm so tired of people saying, well, it was just the white people, white people, white people. No. No. Why are we intentionally leaving others out? There are black founders. Human history. If I ask the audience, when did America have its first African-American judge? What year would you say? Anybody? Take a guess. Judge. 1860s? Anybody? 1770. Amy, is that just a wild guess?
No, not. I wasn't sure exactly, but I think it's about
1770. Tell me.
1768. Wentworth Cheswell, New Hampshire, elected to office in New Hampshire. He was reelected for the next 49 years, held 8 different political positions. Really cool story about him is we all know that Paul Revere made his midnight ride. We also know he wasn't the only guy riding that night. Another guy riding, Wentworth Cheswell, black and white riding.
Now, how is it possible? Did you know that we had an African-American ride to say the British are coming, the British are coming? Amy did. Amy did. Anybody else besides Amy know that? 2, 3. Okay, 3 people in the audience.
Now, the white guy with the sword is Thomas Grosvenor. So you have Thomas Grosvenor and you have Peter Salem, black and white fighting side by side, but Peter is definitely the hero that day. 1817, this painting is done, and all the way up until the 1980s, we knew that that was Peter Salem, the hero of Bunker Hill. 1980s, the professors got together and said, oh no, that's not Peter Salem. We think that that's Grosvenor's slave is who that is. It's not Peter Salem.
Oh, you're kidding.
No, in the 80s, they changed that from Peter Salem to Grosvenor's slave, Asaba. And that's what they say, oh no, it's not Peter, it's Asaba Grosvenor, it's his slave. How come the guy who painted it and the guy who was there and the guy who saw it and painted what he saw had him as Peter Salem, and now we've all convinced, oh no, it's just like...
First, one thing that I think is missing in America, and it is the key to America, has been the difference between individual rights and collective rights, and this man articulated that.
In a speech entitled Our Composite Nationality, Frederick Douglass said, I know of no rights of color superior to the rights of humanity. He thought the worst thing that could happen for blacks after the Civil War was to treat them as exceptions in the law. And so today, with the discursive logjam that we have over things like affirmative action and group rights, and the only thing that you get from government is if you ally with others who look like you or somehow are categorized like you.
This goes into your theory that this is why this is not being taught, because you can't play the victim card. If you don't...
It goes against the traditional victim narrative. After the Civil War, the history was actually written by the losers. That's the one time in history where the losers wrote the history.
That's exactly right.
Really interesting perspective.
That's exactly right.
All right, David, explain quickly. Let's go through these people.
Let's go through these. This guy right here, this is Lemuel Haynes. Lemuel Haynes is a soldier in the American Revolution. He's a black preacher. He's the first black preacher ordained in America that was a pastor of a white congregation in Vermont, Massachusetts, New York, several places.
A black professor in
black
a
preacher,
white.
That's right, in a white church.
Yeah, black minister.
Black minister in a white church in 4 different states. He was ordained in the Congregationalist denomination in 1785. He's the first black to receive a master's degree in America. He got that in 1804 from Middlebury College. So Lemuel Haynes, every year on Washington's birthday, he preached a special sermon about George Washington, his commander-in-chief, in all of his churches where he was.
Unbelievable.
So we don't hear about Lemuel Haynes. This is Benjamin Banneker. I think he's the most brilliant scientist in American history. This guy, unbelievable what he did. He's the guy
more so than Franklin.
I would put Franklin and Banneker almost equal. Now Franklin did a lot of inventions. This guy one time took a pocket watch. He taught himself how to read. He taught himself science. He wrote an almanac that 10 years ahead he was able to predict to the minute solar eclipses, lunar eclipses, 10 years before they happened. I mean, by watching the motion through a telescope, unbelievable what the guy did. He once took the back off a pocket watch, saw how it worked, went home and carved a wooden clock with all the gears, mainspring, and it was accurate to within 1 minute a year. A wooden clock the guy did.
Cow.
He's the guy who laid out Washington, D.C. He's the surveyor who did all that. He's a brilliant mathematician. Jefferson gave him...
Never knew this.
No. Jefferson gave him his example to France, said, hey, you guys in France think that blacks are inferior? Here's Benjamin Banneker.
Okay, first, representatives, I asked, when did we have our first black Speaker of the House? When did we have the first Speaker of the House? 1789. When did we have our first black Speaker of the House? I bet most people would say never.
Never, except it was right here. Joseph Hayne Rainey. Joseph Hayne Rainey of South Carolina is the first black to preside over the House of Representatives. These are the first 7 blacks elected to Congress. You have here Senator Hiram Rhodes Revels, the first black U.S. senator elected. He was a minister of the gospel. He was a missionary. He worked with Frederick Douglass. He recruited 3 regiments of black soldiers in the Civil War, and he was a missionary to slaves in the South. You have here Benjamin Turner, Josiah Wall, this guy right here is really cool. Robert Brown Elliott is probably the most brilliant guy of that era. He actually took on the vice president of the Confederacy in a debate on the floor and just tore his head off. The racist Alexander Stephens. It was a great debate.
When did we turn? Were these guys proud Americans, or did they say
this is the epitome of what we were just talking about. These were individual guys. Half of these guys taught themselves to read. Half of these guys were slaves, and 5 years later they're sitting in Congress. And as slaves, it was a capital offense to learn to read. So these guys in 5 years, and I'll guarantee you read their speeches and records of Congress, you better have a dictionary and a thesaurus in both hands because you want to understand the language they use. It is so brilliant what these guys did.
But were they there to say the white man is bad and the America is bad?
No.
And
these guys were Richard Allen. Let me go back here. Richard Allen had been in slavery. Richard Allen was in slavery, and he held no bitterness at all. He says God would not allow bitterness even in Joseph when he was in prison. Do you think God will allow it in us? He said, we can't have bitterness. He said, by the way, there were some whites who held us in slavery, but it's whites who are working for our freedom. I mean, these guys had no bitterness. They wouldn't allow it.
All praises to the Most High, the creator of creators, the framer and the shaper of all. Heya, heya. Love and light to my loved ones, the copper-colored faces, my melanations, and to the seekers of truth from other persuasions. I like to address a few misconceptions and to shed some light on a few hidden realities that are not accepted as myths or mythology, and I like to present the proof and evidence for confirmation. At this stage in many of our own personal researches and studies, many of us have come to the same conclusions, and in most cases these conclusive results confirm themselves. This confirmation is the true American history, and many of us owe it to our ancestors to know it. Grandmother didn't lie when she told me that they, the white folks, aka the government, used to call us, being the ancestors of today's so-called African Americans, Indians. Then they, the white folks, aka the government, changed it and started calling us Negroes and Coloreds. Your grandfather didn't lie, your great aunts and uncles didn't lie, I know mine didn't, because it's documented and confirmed in the historical accounts and records. Confirmation. This corporation of the United States has historically stripped many of our ancestors of everything from their identity, culture, history, inheritance, prosperity, resources, and land. And this injustice perpetuates to many of us today as our own Dum Diversas, or until different. There's some talk about ADOS, American Descendants of Slaves, and reparations for slavery, but no discussion on many of our ancestors who were American Indians being reclassified as Negroes and at war with the colonizers, who were hell-bent on taking their lands throughout the South. No discussion on all the land that was owned by many of our ancestors that was confiscated by the corporation of the United States through eminent domain and manufactured laws specifically prohibiting Negroes from owning any land, or the manufactured towns, cities, counties, and states that uphold these prohibiting laws, and the crooked city, county, and state officials that manipulated these laws and claimed the land, and the many immigrant tenant farmers and lynch mobs that slaughtered or ran off the American Indians reclassified as Negroes from their land. No, it's bigger than slavery, because many of our seized ancestors were prisoners of war, and many were forced into servitude and subjugated on their own land. Notwithstanding the Aboriginals, or the original people of the Americas, and their descendants today, we have many people with foreign ancestries and foreign DNA whose ancestors only arrived in the Americas just a few centuries ago. Many as recent as 2 centuries claiming the tribes, names, languages, histories, cultures, and the very memory of the Aboriginals of the Americas. Knowing the history, I'm puzzled at how many of these descendants today believe their own fairy tales and conjured history with phenotypes that are the opposite of the original people that they claim to be. Even many people of their own origin are shaking their heads. I have a few friends and associates who are descendants of the immigrants from Europe who agree and tell me that there probably will be more descendants of $5 Indians claiming to be indigenous, but many of their ancestors arrived in Ellis Island after 1906, when the Dawes Roads were closed. When you look at all of the ancient depictions in the drawings, the carvings, the sculptures, the mural illustrations on the walls of temples, and the many codexes before the Mongol-Tartar conquest, you began to see that the people who claim ancestry and descent today from these well-displayed, unmistakably demonstrated and exhibited ancient Aboriginal people from the antiquities of the Americas, who the scientists and historians call proto-Negroids. These ancient Aboriginals of the Americas look nothing like the very people who claim to be of them today. The irony is that these people, the so-called misnomer African Americans, through systematic conditioning, compulsory education, socioeconomic disenfranchisement and suppression, indoctrination from misinformation and propaganda enforced by laws, have been conditioned and programmed to believe that they came from another continent called Africa. These people today, who are called the misnomer of African Americans, look exactly like and identical to the ancient people from the annals of the antiquities of the Americas. Now, if we want to allow a process of elimination by historical and scientific confirmation, genetics confirm that Asians, Caucasians, Eurasians, etc. are mutants of dark-skinned people, or the so-called Negro people. Therefore, many of the current beliefs and claims today are mere manufactured substitutions and imitations. Often imitated, never duplicated. The truth needs no defense. It speaks for itself. I found more confirmation in a book, Making Indians White, The Judicial Abolition of Native Slavery in Revolutionary Virginia and Its Racial Legacy. Now keep in mind, during this time, Virginia was like, say, Washington, D.C. is to the U.S. corporation. So it was like the capital, main governing body of the colonies. And in the introduction, it states that in 1772, George Mason, later famous as the father of the Bill of Rights, represented a slave named Robin and 11 other enslaved plaintiffs in the General Court of Virginia, the colony's highest court. The slaves claimed that maternal descent from an American Indian made their enslavement illegal, and Mason marshaled arguments from natural law and statutory history to support that contention. In a terse one-paragraph opinion typical of the era, the court agreed, freeing the plaintiffs and ordering their former master to pay them nominal damages. See, freedom suits were common in colonial Virginia. Although defined as property for almost all legal purposes and denied rights of citizenship, slaves could allege illegal enslavement and sue for their freedom. Courts recognized such claims throughout the enslaved-holding South from slavery's 17th century beginnings onward. These suits offered one of the few routes to manumission in early America. The ordinary posture of the Robin versus Hardaway case, though, believed its extraordinary result. The court's decision marked a watershed in legal history of Virginian slavery. It was the first recorded holding of an Anglo-American court that maternal descent from an American Indian alone established the right to freedom. This outcome was remarkable in the context of early America, where, despite present-day conceptions that all slaves were Africans, Indian slavery was
ubiquitous. Ubiquitous.
Indian slaves could be found in all 13 mainland British colonies in 1772, as well as in French and Spanish colonies of North America. In Virginian slavery, it was the first recorded holding of an Anglo-American court that maternal descent from an American Indian alone established the right to freedom. This outcome was remarkable in the context of early America, where, despite present-day conceptions that all slaves were Africans, Indian slaves could be found in all 13 main colonies in 1772, as well as in the French and Spanish colonies. Indian slaves could be found in all 13 mainland British colonies in 1772, as well as the French and Spanish colonies of North America. In Virginia alone, thousands of descendants of enslaved Indians toiled alongside African slaves on plantations. This outcome was remarkable in the context of early America, where, despite present-day conceptions that all slaves were Africans, Indian slavery was ubiquitous, meaning well spread and everywhere. Indian slaves could be found in all 13 mainland British colonies in 1772, as well as in the French and Spanish colonies in North America. This outcome was remarkable in the context of early America, where despite present-day conceptions that all slaves were Africans, Indian slavery was ubiquitous, meaning everywhere. This outcome was remarkable in the context of early America, where despite present-day conceptions that all slaves were Africans, Indian slavery was ubiquitous, meaning everywhere, all over. Indian slaves could be found in all 13 mainland British colonies in 1772, as well as in the French and Spanish colonies of North America. In Virginia alone, thousands of descendants of enslaved Indians toiled alongside African slaves on plantations. Robin versus Hardaway repudiated this history and deemed the previously common institution illegal in all but a few circumstances, inaugurating a line of cases that culminated in 1806. In the end, Virginia courts concluded that enslaved descendants of Native Americans were prima facie free, judicially abolishing Indian slavery in Virginia. This precedent spread throughout the antebellum period. Courts in Connecticut, Louisiana, Missouri, New Jersey, South Carolina, and Tennessee all grappled with Virginia's decisions and debated whether maternal descent from American Indians was sufficient to establish freedom. So as you can see, this is basically give you a historical account and records of American Indians being enslaved, being classified as Negroes, and this is in 1772 in Virginia. Explaining this shift in racial basis of slavery is more difficult than observing it. The Robin Court and its successors claimed merely to be engaged in statutory interpretation, and Mason argued for Indians' freedom on the basis of the libertarian principles of the Revolutionary War. This comment argues, however, that the ultimate grounds for this doctrinal innovation lay deeper in the changing demographics of early America. Although not the judges, conscious motivation, Robin and its progeny solidified chattel slavery rather than weaken it by making Indians legally white or black, as we shall see in some instances. The course erased a complex triracial past and created instead a society legally divided into the stark categories of free whites and enslaved blacks. This erasure has present-day legal consequences for federal tribal recognition, struggles over tribal membership, and interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause. To understand the nature of this transformation, this comment builds on two previously unconnected bodies of scholarship. A growing literature on early American history examines the formerly neglected role of Indian slavery and argues that the institution was far more widespread and important than previously thought. These works rely heavily on court records, deeds, and other legal sources and acknowledge the law's importance in passing, but they neglect the legal historical narrative. By ending their chronologies in the mid-18th century, they overlooked the complex judicial debate over the legacy of Indian slavery in revolutionary and antebellum America. By contrast, freedom suits, including those involving plaintiffs claiming Indian descent, have received sustained analysis from legal historians as part of a larger literature on cases of racial determination in which the central and often sole legal issue was a person's racial status. In these instances, faced with the reality of a mixed-race society that rarely aligned with legal categories, courts turned to a variety of methods: appearance, ancestry, science, and reputation, to classify ambiguous individuals, thus laying bare to historical criticism the constructed and arbitrary nature of legal conceptions of race. Robin and its progeny, though, fit uneasily into this conceptual framework. First, as with American legal history more broadly, the current scholarship on racial determination focuses primarily on the period between independence and the Civil War. Before I go on, I want to go back up here right quick, and so you can see that when it stated earlier, when I read it, where was it? Here. That the case for Robin and his progeny solidifies chattel slavery rather than weakening it by making Indians legally white. And I want to go here to where it references. It says, the author says, I use the term white here to reflect the language employed by contemporary participants who often describe Indians as white. So now we're seeing how they were categorizing those who they were categorizing as Indians as white, and those who they were categorizing as Negroes were not Indians anymore. So from here we really get information on pretty much like my grandmother was saying that she heard from some of her elders how they were doing like the brown paper bag test. And if you were darker than a brown paper bag, then you were considered Negro or colored. And if you were a little lighter than the bag, or you could pass, or maybe in a generation or so you could be whitened out or bleached out, then you were passing for white. So that's how they were separating the people. Those that were a lighter complexion, they were categorizing them as white and still allowing them to have their Indian status. Those who were darker, they were classified as Negroes. I found some pretty interesting information in this book titled Before 4 Centuries, a folk book over the discovery of America. It gives information on how the potato got to Europe. The potato is originally an American crop. At least Chile and Mexico are loved for the country. And you know with certainty that this plant could not be found throughout Europe in the past. In 1565, however, there was an Englishman named John Hawkins who earned a daily bread and probably more than that as a slave trader. Since as a result of a long journey, his ship's supply of food in America had to be replenished. He took in Santa Fe, a city near Rio La Plata, in the absence of something better, a kind of tubers on board, which grew there and were eaten by the natives. He still has some of these tubers when he entered a port of Ireland. These tubers were nothing but potatoes. They did not, however, seem to have liked it, for the Irishmen did not consider the planting of the fruit. 19 years later, the English Admiral Walter Raleigh brought the same tubers as some news from Virginia, one of the United States of North America, to England. And in 1589, Clusius, Hugel, teacher at Enlightened, obtained some tubers which were cultivated in the hortus. This crop gradually spread throughout Europe. Of course, use, however, was still so little that Frederick II, the great king of Persia, had to force the stubborn farmers to grow potatoes. This was considered a coercion right. Interesting. It is known that earthquakes and eruptions of volcanoes have caused such tremendous reversals in nature that the surface of the earth, after such terrible events, look very different from before that time. However, it is not only in the realm of nature that these reversals can take place, but also in the realm of civilization and science. The civilization of the Greeks and Romans was brought to an end by the invasions of the rough and uncivilized Huns, who covered the whole of Europe, and then inhabitants, poor and destitute, drove from one region to another, or drove them to such a state of service and slavery, brought civilization and science to an end. No locust plague has ever brought greater destruction to the harvest in Egypt than the Huns plague brought to European civilization. So this right here gives reference and historical account of how these Huns, when they came from the steppes out of Siberia into the regions of Europe and started invading and assimilating and taking over these territories, how they basically took what was civilized and reversed it to an uncivilized state. To confirm what has already been confirmed by science, by scientists, now I can give you some confirmations by anthropology. And here's a book, The Racial History of Man, by Roland B. Dixon, professor of anthropology at Harvard University. And this was written in 1923. And let me scroll down. I wanted to also, what I like to do is when I'm looking at a lot of these older books, these older references and these compilations, a lot of times it may have one person's name on it as the primary author or editor or whatnot. But once you look into like some of the prefaces or acknowledgments and whatnot, you can start seeing some of the people who were instrumental and how this was not just a person doing it, was a compilation of minds. And when I look at, research, I try to research the researchers. And in this case, I was looking at how Dr. Frank Boas of Columbia University was one of several, like Dr. Clark Weisler, Dr. Alice Hendricklicker. All of these different notable, very knowledgeable and esteemed people were a part of, putting this compilation of information together. And as far as Dr. Frank Boas, I'd like to also bring out that he is, of course, German-born American anthropologist and a pioneer of modern anthropology, who has been called the father of American anthropology. So this is a guy who was called the father of American anthropology, so he is very familiar with a lot of the older, more ancient skulls, bones, and whatnot that were excavated or found in a lot of the mounds and other, burial sites throughout the Americas during this period in the 1800s, in the early 1900s, and whatnot. So this also is a person who was accredited and thanked, for a lot of great value of information that was gathered in putting this together. So I just like to point that out because it's good to look at who researching, research the researchers, find out what they're about, what's their angle, biased or non-biased, impartial or partial. So I like to look at things like that, just to give me a more in tune perspective. So it's good. That's good for us, to just keep in mind as we start doing our research. Research the researchers. Find out what they're about. And I would like to give a big shout out to Fatu Diarra, who actually put a post out on this and kind of sparked some research, and I looked into it and I'm putting pieces together to basically confirm, the confirmations of those people that they would call Aboriginals and who they were and how they were here eons before anybody else. And this is basically scientific confirmations. And this also is confirmed through anthropology. And there's several anthropologists who all have these same confirmations that there were what they were calling proto-Australoid and proto-Negroid inhabitants Want to know the truth about the Aboriginals of the Americas, North, Central, South, Caribbean, so-called Negroes? Forget about the historians and go straight to the anthropology text. Please take note of some of the direct quotes from anthropology text. The Racial History of Man, written in 1923. So on page 401, it states that the Proto-Australoid must have been of the earliest, if not the earliest, type to spread into the North American continent. That right there, based on the anthropology, is confirmed. who the original people of this land or what they were looking like. It seems on the whole probable that the proto-Australoid must have been one of the earliest, if not the earliest, type to spread into the North American continent. On the Pacific coast in California and Lower California, it appears to constitute the oldest stratum, characterizing as it does the crania from the lower layers of the shale heaps from the islands of Santa Catalina and San Clemente off the coast, and from the extinct Peruqua, isolated in the southern tip of the peninsula of Lower California. It is, moreover, prominent among the ancient basket makers of northern Arizona, who represent probably one of the earliest peoples in this whole area. In the northeast, the type is of importance among the Iroquois and the southern Algonquin tribes, such as the Lenape. Says on page 42 to 43 that the Proto-Negro type has a very striking distribution. So let's look and see what it says on that. Proto-Negro type has a very striking distribution. In the sense, except for its rather unexpected strength among the ancient basket makers in Arizona, it nowhere seems to have played an important part in the whole area west of the Rocky Mountains. Except for the rather unexpected strength among the ancient basket makers in Arizona, it nowhere seems to have played an important part in the whole area west of the Rocky Mountains, which were where the Plain Indians or the Mongol-Tartar Indians that had migrated from Canada via Alaska via Siberia in the 1400s into North American plains. So that's where they were. So you can see that by anthropology, it confirms who the people were and the oldest remains that were found in those particular areas. It kind of gives you a story and a history. It is nevertheless of considerable importance among the Iroquois and southern Algonquin tribes, and in the early crania from the Turner Group mounds in the Ohio Valley and the prehistoric Cisgrave people of Tennessee. all which suggest a rather special concentration in the eastern portion of the continent. It is also significant in connection with the presence of these types in the basket makers that it is the dominant factor in the crania from the burial caves in Colula in northern Mexico, since many striking similarities in culture have been pointed out between these two people. Page 409, the larger number of crania are from sites in central and eastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and show on analysis that the dominant element in all the area is most unexpectedly the Proto-Negroid. What? Okay, let's look at that. We're going to go to 409. And here it says that the larger number of the crania are from sites in central and eastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and show on analysis that the dominant element in all of this area is, most unexpectedly, the Proto-Negroid. At first thought, such a suggestion seems impossible, yet on the basis of the criteria here adopted, the fact cannot be denied, and as the crania are, with a few exceptions, almost certainty pre-European or from the period of the earliest contact, no possibility of historic Negro mixture is admissible. When it is remembered that the same type is found in considerable strength in the Baltic region of northwestern Russia in prehistoric and early historic times, and it is a strong factor among the present-day Ainu of northern Japan. For 11, taking first the Iroquois crania, which are a main prehistoric and proto-historic age, we find on the basis of a combined series from the different single tribes that these people were at least as similar to both the Kinetic Valley and the Lenape series as either of these is to the other. In all three, the primary factor is the Proto-Negroid, the secondary the Proto-Australoid. Alright, this is the part that I really want to get to that I found very interesting, actually very striking, and it kind of confirms what I've been trying to prove. And what better way than to use what they are, science don't prove it. Oh, okay, well, let's see. This is what I'm going to go over. The Turner Group Mounds has yielded some of the most remarkable objects ever found in the Ohio Valley, and the builders must have belonged to the higher cultural stratum here, sometimes referred to as the Hopewell culture, from the name of the site where it is particularly well revealed. This culture was, so far as we know, quite extinct in the region at the time of the first European contact, and thus represents an older type that found in Madisonville. The crania from these mounds are furthermore of two periods, one contemporary with the erection of the mounds, the other later and intrusive, although the number of crania complete enough for determining the types is seen. So right here, it lets you know that there were two types or two periods, one contemporary with the erection of the mounds. Those were the Aboriginals. The other later and intrusive. Those were the Mongol Tatars from Siberia that migrated, invaded, and assimilated into the North American cultures, or South American and Central American cultures. and civilizations. So right here, according to the anthropology, it gives you, really sound information as to who these mound builders were. And it really lets you know there were two periods of them. You got basically two waves: original people, the Aboriginals, and then the secondary. So let's go even further. It says that the crania from these mounds are furthermore two periods, one contemporary with the erection of the mounds, the other later and intrusive. Although the number of crania complete enough for determining a type is small, it seems possible to reach the following conclusions. First, that the builders of the mounds were a people among whom dialectocephalic factors were in a large majority. And
dolichocephalic
means having a relatively long skull. Okay. So they were in a large majority. Second, that these were mainly of the Proto-Australoid and Proto-Negro types, and thus show affiliation with the Iroquois and Southern Algonquin tribes. And third, that the intrusion burials of later date show an even larger proportion of long-headed elements, some of which are, however, left of ring, thus differing them from the earlier crania, among whom the narrow-nosed, long-headed factors were particularly absent. So, as we read in this, you can see that the earliest account of the cranias that they are studying are Proto-Australoid, Proto-Negroid, pretty much the same people. If you want to break it down, the earliest people, the Aboriginals. Now, the presence of a strong Proto-Negroid factor among these prehistoric crania raises a particularly troublesome question. As it is well known, the modern population of Brazil, both Indian and white, is known to have had a considerable infusion of Negro blood in the period since the 15th century. How are we to tell, then, in the case of living tribes, such, for example, as the Caraya of the Brazilian highlands, when we find evidence of a strong Proto-Negroid factor? Whether this element is to be regarded as aboriginal and derived from the ancient stratum of this type, or is it to be traced to recent miscegenation with the Negroes introduced by the Portuguese settlers? Well, that's a contradiction, because the same Portuguese or conquistadors from Portugal, the Suave, and also the Visigoths, when they first came over here in the 1500s, they called the inhabitants of Brazil the Negroes de Terra, the blacks of the land. So there were already Aboriginals here prior to them bringing any other so-called Negroes here. So we have to keep that in context. We understand that we had Aboriginals here. The cranials is proving this. So this is just his speculation, saying, I wonder, is this, from those who they brought over, these are the Aboriginals that were already here? Well, common sense, they were Aboriginals that were already here. And they were called the Negroes de Terra by the first conquistadors when they first arrived in the 1500s. This is recorded in the Jesuit letters, and also a lot of the conquistador journals. So I wanted to go ahead and bring that out just for more confirmation that we have scientific anthropology proven confirmations that the first inhabitants of the Americas were Proto-Negroid, Proto-Australoid, and in some cases it was more Proto-Negroid than they were Proto-Australoid. So you can see there were two people groups primarily. Some what you would call the Pacific Islanders. And remember in the early edition I went over how a lot of them were flushed out of what was now China, the Asia, the southern China, into the Pacific Islands, into Australia. They was flushed out. They basically traveled to Pacific and came to the Americas. Well, when they arrived here, they were already, so-called Negro or Proto-Negroes that were already here. So this is being confirmed by anthropology. We can, however, be confident that, as in the north, the Caspian type is far and away the most important one in the Leptarian group, whereas the Platarian, the Proto-Negroid, largely outnumbers the Proto-Australoid, at least in the two most important series, i.e., those from Lagoa Santa in Brazil and Paltel Calo in Ecuador. Now, the presence of a strong Proto-Negroid factor among these prehistoric crania raises a particular troublesome question. As is well known, the modern population of Brazil, both Indian and white, is known to have had a considerable infusion of Negro blood in the period since the 15th century. How are we to tell then, in the case of living tribes, such for example as the Caraya of the Brazilian highlands, when we find evidence of a strong Proto-Negroid factor, whether this element is to be regarded as aboriginal and derived from the ancient stratum of this type, or is it to be traced to recent miscegenation with the Negroes introduced by the Portuguese settlers? Okay, well, that is a contradiction right there, because when these Portuguese or these conquistadors, these Portuguese Suave conquistadors, along with their cousins, the Visigoths or the Spanish, when those conquistadors first arrived here in the 1500s, in Brazil, they called those people the Negros de Terra, the blacks of the land. So that proves that there were already Proto-Negroid people already here, or Aboriginal people already here, prior to any Portuguese bringing any Negroes or introducing other further Negroes from anywhere else. They were already, according to the anthropology, in these confirmations, there were Proto-Negroid as well as Proto-Australoid crania in the Americas. These predate any other cranias ever found in the Americas. So that proves who the Aboriginal people are. And then it says right here that, it was a strong Proto-Negroid factor. And this factor basically outweighed the Proto-Australoid factor in some cases, in some areas. There were stronger concentrations of Proto-Negroid crania than there were Proto-Australoid. So I want to just bring up that. And again, a shout out to Fatou Diarra for the information for the post. Actually gave me a spark. I want to look into it. It kind of ties and connects to what I've been looking into as far as confirming who were the Aboriginal people of the Americas. So we can cut the chase. You can, kill all the noise about, other types or phenotypes or other groups of people claiming what is not theirs. According to the confirmations through anthropology, through several anthropologies, the oldest crania found in the Americas are Proto-Negroid and Proto-Australoid. Period. Those are the Aboriginal people. So we can go ahead and kind of, put that to bed now. We know who the Aboriginal people are. And when the governor had made that comment about he knew who he was talking about, he's being honest. They know we are the Aboriginal people. They know this. We just need to wake up to the fact of who we really are. The Aboriginal people, or the descendants of those Aboriginal people today. So I thought that was kind of interesting what they was going over. They basically admitting that, the South America crania, Proto-Negroid, was the chiefly represented. It says the Proto-Negro type is that chiefly represented. So that's more and more confirmation onto who are the original or Aboriginal people, or those who descended from the Aboriginal people of the Americas. And this gives you more and more confirmation of who the people were in this land prior to, say, Mongol Tartars invading, and then those tribes of the Alemanni, Suave, the Visigoths, the Anglos, Saxons, Lombards, when all them come over. So they all came and encountered the same groups of people, the Proto-Negro, Proto-Australoid. So this is just more confirmation that every landmass had their own group of Aboriginal people. Period. This is just more confirmation that there were Aboriginal people on every landmass on Earth. So the Americas shouldn't be no exception. You find Aboriginal people in what is now the continent of Australia, they were discovered in 1606. So who do you think they discovered in 1492 when they came to Americas? And after that?
When Giovanni de Verrazzano was exploring the Atlantic coast from Carolina up into the New York area, he had wrote a letter to Francis I, the King of France, in 1524, describing the Carolina Indians as being dark in color, not unlike the Ethiopians. Giovanni de Verrazzano had described the Carolina Indians as exactly resembling the Ethiopians. And also in Beaufort, South Carolina, the Spanish explorer or Spanish colonizer, Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón, had came in contact with the Yamasee Indians in 1520, and he described the Yamasee as being Negroes being valuable in labor. So as soon as Vasquez de Ayllón had pulled up to the Atlantic and Carolina, he was trying to enslave the Yamasee Indians, who he had described as being Negroes, the same Yamasee Indians that we see existing today in Allendale, South Carolina. That's the ancestors of today's Yamasee Indians. When William Penn came to New Jersey, the same William Penn that Pennsylvania, Penn State, and Penn University is named after, the same William Penn that's on the Quaker's grist box here. When he came in contact with the Lenape Indians in 1683, William Penn described the Lenapes as being a complexion black, but by design like the Gypsies in England. Is how William Penn described the Lenapes, who's also known as the Delaware. That's in the Northeast region around New Jersey, Delaware, and the Lenape still exist there today in that same region in New Jersey and Delaware. Plains natives or Mongoloids did not live in the Southeast, the Northeast, or California in the Pacific historically. The only area that the Plains or Mongoloid-looking natives lived was the Northwest and the Southwest, and they only got to the Southwest in Arizona and New Mexico and Colorado because they moved down, they migrated from the Northwest in Montana, Dakota, in Idaho and Washington. That's the only area that the Mongoloids or Plains people historically live. They are migrational people. So-called Black Americans are autochthonous. We originated from the soil of the earth. The soil of North America is where misnamed, reclassified Black Americans originated from. So historically, the only people that lived in the Southeast and the Northeast and the West Coast were so-called black people, indigenous people that look like so-called black people according to the Europeans' earliest historical documented accounts. There were no Plains or Mongoloids on the East Coast, the Southeast, or the West Coast, ever. They only lived in the Northwest, the Mongoloids. The Mongoloids only live in the Northwest. Mongoloids never lived in the Southeast, in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, the Carolinas, Virginia, Carolina, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, California, Texas. Mongoloids never lived in none of those places. That was only indigenous, misnamed black people. Mongoloids only lived in the Northwest. In Virginia, well over a decade before the first imported Negroes were shipped into Jamestown, Virginia from the Caribbean in 1619, John Smith in 1607 had encountered the Powhatan Nation and described them as being so-called misnomer black people. The same John Smith that we've seen in the Pocahontas movie. John Smith had described Pocahontas' people as being indigenous black people, according to his own historical voyage accounts. John Smith, when he was at war with the Powhatan Indians, he described the Powhatan Algonquin chief as being more like a devil than a man, with some 200 more as black as himself. And the Algonquins were the Powhatans, the Narragansetts, and the Wampanoag. They live all up and down the Atlantic eastern seaboard, from Massachusetts and Rhode Island to Virginia and the Carolinas, that was all Algonquin territory, and they looked alike exactly how the Narragansett people look today and how the Wampanoag people look today. That's all the same people.
The ancient code of Haiti, Haiti, represented a nation of beasts. This is what he referred to them as beasts by the historical songs. Whose historical songs? The Albion's historical songs. So, he's saying that the indigenous people of Haiti were black, which we know that they are predominantly so-called black now. California of the Carib Islands, called Black Caribs or the Guiani by others. There was what? So-called Black Carib. And they was what's called the Califanani. Or the Califanans. You have the Okoro of Hutara, mentioned by Garcia in the West Indies. He said they're quite black. The Auroras of Raleigh, or Auroras of the Spaniards, ugly black or brown Negroes, yet existing near the Orinoco, and language known called monkey by their neighbors. Kayamas of Guyana, brown Negroes like Hottentots. You had the Manjapas of Parsigis of the Nayahof, and the Matayas of Kniv, of Kedves, or all of Brazil, black, right? He's saying that he said they here brown Negroes with curly hair. So all of these people was in Brazil, obviously before the slave trade, brown and red Negroes who was already in these areas, in California, in Florida, Georgia.
That to me is a Negro case.
imitated, never duplicated.